The First National Bank of Redemption smelled of old paper-oiled steel and the faint, sweet scent of a lie. It was the smell of prosperity, fragile as a desert flower, and Eli Barrett hated it. He stood before the teller's cage, his hat held respectfully in his hands. The worn felt a testament to a life lived far from the polished brass and mahogany of the bank's interior. The sun, a merciless white eye in a bleached sky, streamed through the tall windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air like tiny frantic ghosts. It was a place for men who measured their worth in columns of figures, and Eli's only ledger was the tally of losses etched around his eyes. He slid the withdrawal slip under the grate. The clerk, a young man with a thin mustache and an even thinner smile, barely glanced at him. Eli was a ghost in this town now, a relic from a time before Sheriff Caleb Pike had promised order and the railroad had promised wealth. To them, he was just the widower from the old Barrett ranch, a man who kept to himself on the edge of the territories. "All of it," Mr. Barrett the clerk asked, his voice betraying a sliver of surprise. Eli just nodded, his throat tight. All of it. 2 years of savings scrimped from selling off the last of his good stock, every coin a painful memory of a future that had died with his wife. It was just enough for the headstone. Not the grand marble angel he felt she deserved, but a simple, dignified slab of granite carved with her name, Sarah Barrett. A final solid thing in a world that had become vapor and shadow. He felt the familiar pang in his chest, a dull ache that had become as much a part of him as his own heartbeat. Sarah. She had been the town's heart, once a healer whose hands could soothe a fevered child or set a broken bone with equal grace. But a sickness had come swift and cruel, and her herbs and knowledge had not been enough. The town in its fear had turned on her. Whispers of unnatural ways had followed her down the boardwalk, the same whispers that had once been prayers of gratitude. She hadn't died from their suspicion, but it had hollowed her out, leaving her vulnerable to the fever that finally took her. Eli had been unable to protect her from their words, and he had been unable to save her from her fate. This stone was his penance, a weight to anchor her memory against the shifting sands of time. As the clerk counted out the bills, Eli's thumb traced the cool, intricate surface of the silver locket he held in his other hand. It was a small oval, etched with desert primrose, Sarah's favorite. Inside was a tiny, faded portrait of them on their wedding day, his own face impossibly young, hers bright with a hope he could no longer recall. It was the last piece of her he had. The quiet of the bank was shattered by the splintering crash of the front door. 3 men burst in their faces, hidden by grimy bandanas, their movements economical and brutal. The leader, a tall man with eyes as cold and gray as a winter river, held 2 pistols with an unnerving stillness. On the floor, now his voice rasped, cutting through the sudden terrified silence. The world slowed. The clerk's hands froze over the stack of bills. A woman screamed, a sound abruptly choked off. Eli's first instinct, the old instinct of a man who knew violence, was to reach for the Colt peacemaker holstered at his hip. But he was no gunslinger, not anymore. He was a rancher, a widower, a man buying a headstone. He dropped to the rough sawn floorboards with the others, the smell of dust and fear filling his nostrils. The robbers moved with practiced efficiency. One vaulted the counter, stuffing cash into a canvas sack. Another kept his pistol trained on the terrified customers. The leader stalked the room, his boots thudding with a predator's confidence. He stopped beside Eli, his shadow falling over him like a shroud. "What's that you got there, old man?" The leader's voice was low, almost conversational. Eli's hand instinctively tightened around the locket. A mistake. The man's boot lashed out, catching Eli hard in the ribs. Air exploded from his lungs in a pained gasp. Before he could recover, rough fingers pried his hand open. The silver locket was snatched away. No, Eli choked out the word, a ragged plea. Please, anything else? The leader held the locket up, letting it twist on its delicate chain. He flicked it open with his thumb, glanced at the tiny portrait inside, and then let out a short, contemptuous laugh. Pretty thing. He snapped it shut and shoved it into his pocket. The act was so casual, so dismissive, it felt more violent than the kick. It was the erasure of a life of a love for the fleeting value of its silver casing. A wave of cold fury washed over Eli, momentarily eclipsing the pain. He pushed himself up his hand, finally going to his gun, but he was too slow. The butt of the robber's pistol crashed down on the side of his head. The world dissolved into a flash of white light and a roaring in his ears. As his consciousness frayed, the last thing he saw was the robber turning away. The last thing he felt was the agonizing, empty space in his palm where Sarah's memory had been. He had failed her again. A week later, the sickness came to redemption like a thief in the night. It started as a low fever in the children, a cough that settled deep in the chests of the men who worked the railroad line. Cattle stumbled in the fields, their legs weak, their eyes glassy and dull. Fear, a far more contagious disease, coiled in the dusty streets. It soured the beer in the saloon and poisoned the gossip that passed over the cracker barrels at the general store. Sheriff Caleb Pike cultivated that fear with the careful hand of a master gardener. He was a man built of straight lines and hard angles from his neatly trimmed beard to the perfectly creased trousers tucked into his polished boots. He had brought order to redemption, replacing the casual violence of the frontier with the rigid certainty of his law. His voice, calm and resonant, was a balm to the panicked townspeople. "This is a trial," he declared from the steps of his office, his hand resting on the Bible he always kept nearby. "A test of our faith. We must be vigilant against the sources of corruption, both in our water and in our souls. Some things are a punishment, a curse for meddling with God's natural order." His words hung in the air, finding fertile ground in the hearts of the anxious. They looked for a cause, a scapegoat, something tangible to blame, for the invisible enemy that stalked their homes, and they found one in Mara Quinn. She had arrived 2 months prior, a quiet woman with knowing hands and eyes that saw more than most. She lived in a small cabin by the creek, the one that had been empty since Old Man Hemlock died. She was a healer like Sarah Barrett, had been her remedies drawn from the earth willow bark, for fever sage for cleansing wounds. At first, the town had been grateful. She had eased the croup in the blacksmith's son and set the broken arm of a ranch hand. But now, with a new sickness that her herbs couldn't seem to touch, gratitude curdled into suspicion. Her knowledge, once a comfort, became foreign and frightening. Eli heard the whispers when he rode into town for supplies, his head still aching from the blow he'd taken. He had spent the week in a haze of grief and rage, the ranch a prison of memories. The empty space on the mantel where Sarah's locket used to sit was a constant screaming accusation. "She uses strange plants," muttered Martha Gable, the owner of the general store, as she weighed out a bag of flour for Eli. Her face, usually a road map of cheerful gossip, was pinched with worry. "Not like your Sarah. Sarah was a good Christian woman. This one, she keeps to herself. Sings strange songs by the creek. It ain't natural." Eli's jaw tightened. "Sarah sang songs by the creek," he said, his voice a low rumble. "And her plants were the same ones God put on this earth." Mrs. Gable flushed, refusing to meet his eyes. "It's different, Eli. Reverend Hale says so. He says it's the devil's work, a plague brought on by a witch in our midst." The name hung in the air between them, ugly and venomous. Witch. The same word they had started to whisper about Sarah in the end. Eli paid for his supplies, his movement stiff, and left without another word. The fear in the town was a physical thing, thick and suffocating, as the dust that coated everything. He could feel it closing in, seeking a release, and he knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone where it would strike. As he was loading his saddlebags, the town bell began to toll. Not the slow, steady ring for Sunday service, but a frantic, clamoring clang that spoke of alarm and fury. A crowd was gathering in the town square, a river of angry bodies flowing toward the old cottonwood tree by the riverbank. Their faces were a mask of righteous certainty, their voices a single, ugly chant. Eli's blood ran cold. He swung himself onto his horse, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He knew what he would find. He had seen this particular brand of fear before, had felt its sting, and he had stood by and done nothing. Not this time. This time, he would not fail. He spurred his horse forward, pushing through the edge of the mob. In the center of the square, he saw her, Mara Quinn. She was on her knees, her dress torn, her face streaked with dirt and blood. Sheriff Pike stood over her, a coil of thick rope in his hand, his face a mask of grim satisfaction. Reverend Hale was beside him, his Bible held aloft like a weapon, his voice screeching condemnation. "She has confessed to nothing," Hale cried. "Her silence is proof of her guilt. The witch will not defy the will of this town." Eli saw Mara's eyes wide with terror, but holding a core of defiance that reminded him so fiercely of Sarah, it stole his breath. He saw the rope. He saw the looming branches of the cottonwood, a makeshift gallows against the unforgiving sky. And in that moment, the town's verdict, Sarah's ghost, and the loss of the locket, all coalesced into a single sharp point of action. He had been unable to protect his wife's memory. He would not stand by and watch another innocent woman be sacrificed on the altar of fear. He slid his rifle from its scabbard. He didn't raise it, didn't aim. He just held it, the weight of it familiar and solid in his hands. He spurred his horse directly into the heart of the crowd, parting them like the Red Sea. He reined in just before Pike, his horse snorting its eyes wide. The square fell silent. Every eye turned to him. Eli's gaze was fixed on Pike. "Let her go, Caleb." His voice was quiet, but it carried across the square with the deadly finality of a cocked hammer. Pike's expression hardened. "This is town business, Barrett. It doesn't concern you. She's a witch who brought sickness upon us." "You've got no proof of that," Eli said, his voice flat. "Only the word of a preacher who sells fear and your own ambition. You're not hanging her." A murmur went through the crowd. This was not the broken recluse they knew. This was a different man, a man they had forgotten existed. Pike took a step forward, his hand hovering over the butt of his pistol. "I am the law in redemption. I say she hangs." Eli finally looked away from Pike, his eyes scanning the faces in the crowd, men he'd known his whole life, women Sarah had nursed back to health. He saw their fear, their confusion, their desperate need to blame someone. Then his eyes settled on Mara, crumpled on the ground. He thought of her predecessors, the healers and wise women who had been punished for their knowledge. He thought of Sarah. With a fluid motion, he dismounted, never taking his eyes off the sheriff. He walked to Mara, knelt down, and drew his Bowie knife. The crowd gasped. For a terrifying second, they thought he meant to do the job himself. Instead, he reached for the ropes that bound her hands, and with a single decisive slice, cut them free. He stood, pulling her gently to her feet. She swayed, leaning against him for support, her small frame trembling. "She's coming with me," Eli said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "If you want her, you'll have to come through me." He helped her onto his horse, then swung up behind her, his arm a protective barrier around her waist. He stared down at Pike, whose face was a thunderous mask of fury and disbelief. The challenge had been issued. For a long moment, the world held its breath. Then Eli turned his horse and without a backward glance rode slowly and deliberately out of the square, leaving a stunned town and a thwarted sheriff in his wake. The ride to the ranch was a silent journey through a landscape of rust-colored rock and skeletal mesquite. The canyons whispered with old secrets as the wind snaked through them, and the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in bruised shades of orange and purple. Mara was a fragile weight against him, her breathing shallow, her body trembling with the aftershocks of terror. Eli could feel the sharp edges of her shoulder blades through her thin dress, and he held her gently, his calloused hands unaccustomed to such delicate contact. His ranch was nestled in a small, defensible valley, a handful of sturdy buildings crafted from timber and stone, surrounded by a fence that was more a line on the land than a real barrier. It was a place of solitude, a sanctuary that had for the past 2 years felt more like a tomb. As they rode into the yard, the familiar sight of the homestead, the porch Sarah had loved, the garden she had tended now, overgrown with weeds, sent a fresh wave of grief through him. He was bringing a stranger into this sacred, sorrowful space. He slid from the saddle and carefully lifted Mara down. She was as light as a child. Her knees buckled the moment her feet touched the ground, and he swept her into his arms without a second thought, carrying her across the porch and through the front door. The interior was dark and smelled of wood smoke, dust, and old sorrows. He laid her gently on a cot near the cold hearth, her exhaustion so profound she seemed to sink into the thin mattress. He lit a lantern, the soft yellow light pushing back the shadows, and then built a fire. The crackle of the kindling was the first sound to break the oppressive silence. He brought her a tin cup of water from the pump, holding it to her lips. At first, she didn't stir. Then her eyelids fluttered open, dark pools of fear and confusion. She saw him, a big, grim-faced stranger looming over her, and she gasped, trying to push his hand away. "You're safe here," Eli said, his voice softer than he intended. "Drink." Her throat worked as she took a few tentative sips. The water seemed to revive some small part of her. She looked around the simple cabin, at the rifle mounted over the door, at the sparse, functional furniture, the overwhelming sense of a place inhabited by ghosts. Tears welled in her eyes and traced clean paths through the grime on her cheeks. "They called me a witch," she whispered, her voice cracked and raw. "They beat me, said I cursed the cattle, but I only tried to heal them." Eli pulled up a stool and sat, giving her space. He leaned back, his big frame seeming to take up half the room, and simply listened. Her voice, though shaky, held a steady current of integrity that he recognized instantly. She told him how she used herbs passed down from her grandmother to bring down fevers in children, how she ground willow bark into a tea for men coughing their lungs out after the hard winter, how she refused payment from families who had nothing. It was a simple story of compassion, a story he knew intimately. He frowned, rubbing the graying stubble on his chin. This didn't sound like a witch. This sounded like Sarah. It sounded like his own mother before her. He got up and walked to a dusty bookshelf. He reached for an old leather-bound book, its spine cracked, and its pages yellowed with age. He ran his hand over the cover, the worn leather soft beneath his fingers. It was his mother's journal, passed down to Sarah, filled with generations of knowledge notes on every remedy and poultice they had ever used. The pages smelled of dust, dried lavender, and smoke. He brought it back to the lantern light and flipped through the brittle pages. The handwriting shifted from his mother's neat, looping script to Sarah's more hurried, practical scrawl. He found the section on fevers. There it was: sage leaves for cleansing, willow bark for pain, field thyme to clear the lungs, the exact same herbs Mara had named. He looked up from the book, his eyes meeting hers. "These are the same cures my mother wrote down. The same ones my wife used." His voice was low but firm, a declaration of fact in a world built on lies. "You did nothing wrong." For the first time since he'd cut her down from that tree, a flicker of something other than fear appeared in Mara's eyes. A faint spark of hope. She managed a small, fragile smile. It wasn't wide, not bright, but it was enough to show she still wanted to live. As the fire crackled and shadows danced on the walls, Eli knew that rescuing her from the rope was only the beginning. Men like Pike and Hale did not let go of their power so easily. They would not be satisfied until Mara was silenced and their narrative of fear was restored. Just as the thought crossed his mind, he heard it. A faint sound from outside, carried on the night wind. The steady, deliberate crunch of boots on the gravel path leading to his door. It wasn't the sound of one man. It was several. They were coming for her again. Eli rose silently from his chair, his body moving with an economy of motion that belied his size. His hand went to the iron at his hip, his thumb resting on the hammer of the Colt. The fight wasn't over. It had just followed them home. The crunch of boots grew louder, stopping just outside. A sharp, authoritative knock rattled the wooden door. "Barrett, open up. This is Sheriff Pike." The voice was calm, controlled, but laced with an undercurrent of cold fury. "You're harboring a fugitive. Hand the witch over now before I'm forced to consider you an accomplice." Eli moved to the door, his shadow long and menacing in the firelight. He glanced back at Mara, who had pushed herself up on the cot, her eyes wide with renewed terror. He gave her a short, almost imperceptible shake of his head before turning back to the door. He didn't unbolt it. "She's no fugitive," Caleb Eli called through the thick timber. "She's an innocent woman you tried to murder in broad daylight. You're on my land. State your business and leave." There was a moment of silence from the other side, then a low chuckle. "Your land. This whole territory is under my jurisdiction, and my business is justice. The town wants the witch. I aim to give them what they want." "What you want, you mean?" Eli countered, his voice like flint. "Go home, Caleb. There's nothing for you here tonight. I've got 3 deputies with me." Barrett Pike's voice turned hard. "Don't make this difficult. We can do this easy, or we can do this hard. Your choice." Eli felt the familiar cold burn of anger in his gut. He knew Pike. He knew the man wouldn't risk a direct assault, not yet. It would be too messy, too hard to explain. Pike preferred the clean lines of the law, even when he had to bend them to his will. This was a test of nerve. "You've got no warrant," Eli stated flatly. "You come through that door, you're trespassing. And I'll defend my home. You know I will." The threat hung in the air, unspoken, but perfectly understood. Eli Barrett was not a man to be trifled with on his own property. The silence stretched thick with tension. Eli could hear the wind whistling around the eaves, the nervous shuffle of boots on the gravel. He imagined Pike's face tight with frustration, weighing his options. Finally, Pike spoke again, his voice dripping with venom. "You've made a powerful enemy today, Eli. You think you can stand against a whole town? You're a fool. You're protecting something that ain't worth dying for. When they come for her with torches, don't say I didn't warn you." The footsteps retreated, fading into the night. Eli waited, his body coiled and ready, until he was sure they were gone. He let out a slow breath he hadn't realized he was holding, and turned back to Mara. She was staring at him, her lips parted in disbelief. "You risked everything," she whispered. Eli walked back to the fire, his expression unreadable. "No," he said, stoking the embers. "I only risked what was already mine to lose." He looked at her, then his gaze steady as stone. But he's right about one thing. They won't stop. We need to find out what's really making people sick. We need proof. Real proof that can't be twisted. For the next several days, the ranch became a fortress and a laboratory. While Eli patrolled the perimeter, his rifle never far from his hand, Mara began her work. Her initial terror gave way to a quiet, focused determination. She explored the overgrown garden behind the house, her fingers gently identifying the herbs Sarah had planted years ago. She found mint chamomile and a hardy patch of yarrow. It was a ghost of a garden, but it was enough. The sickness Pike described, she said one evening, grinding dried leaves with a stone pestle. The weakness, the stomach pains, the delirium. It doesn't behave like any fever I know. It acts more like a poison. Eli paused in cleaning his rifle, the scent of gun oil sharp in the air. Poison. A slow one, she confirmed, her brow furrowed in concentration. Something they're ingesting, in the water or the food. The idea settled in Eli's mind, heavy and ugly. It made a horrifying kind of sense. A witch was a simple, terrifying explanation. A poisoner was something far more deliberate, far more sinister. Their investigation began in earnest, under the cover of darkness. They moved like shadows across the land, avoiding the main roads, using the gullies and arroyos Eli knew from his youth. Their first stop was the pasture belonging to Jedediah Croft, a rancher whose entire herd had been decimated. They found the carcass of a steer near a dry creek bed, its body bloated, its eyes vacant. While Eli stood watch, Mara knelt beside the animal. She ran her hands over its hide, examined its mouth. Then, with a deep breath, she took a small, sharp knife from the satchel at her waist and made a careful incision. Eli looked away, the clinical nature of the act unsettling him. After a few minutes, she stood wiping the blade on a clump of grass. "His insides are inflamed," she said, her voice grim. "And there's a strange metallic smell. It's arsenic. I'm almost certain of it." Arsenic. The word was a death sentence. It was used to dip sheep to kill rats, but in large enough doses, it was a killer of men and beasts alike. Where would it come from? Eli asked, his mind racing. It would have to be in their feed or their water source, Mara replied. Somewhere it could be administered slowly, over time. Their next target was the feed store on the edge of town, owned by a man named Silas Croft, Jedediah's cousin, and a staunch supporter of Sheriff Pike. They waited until well after midnight, when the moon was hidden behind a bank of clouds. Eli jimmied the lock on the back door with practiced ease, a skill from a past he preferred not to dwell on. Inside, the store smelled of grain and burlap. Sacks of feed were stacked high in the gloom. They moved quickly and quietly, using a shielded lantern. On a dusty shelf in the back room, tucked behind a stack of old ledgers, they found a half-empty crate of glass jars filled with a fine white powder. The label was stark arsenic trioxide. Danger. Eli's jaw set hard. This was it. This was the source. But who was behind it? Silas was a follower, not a leader. He wouldn't have the nerve for something like this on his own. As they were about to leave, Mara's light fell on a small leather-bound tally book lying on the desk. She picked it up and flipped through the pages. Most of it was simple accounting sacks of oats, pounds of corn. But on the last few pages, there were different entries. Not sales, but payouts. Large sums of money listed next to dates that corresponded with the outbreak of the sickness. Beside each entry were two sets of initials, SC and CP. Silas Croft and Caleb Pike. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. Pike wasn't just using the sickness. He was creating it. But why, to what end? Was it just a land grab, poisoning cattle to force ranchers like Jedediah to sell cheap? It seemed too elaborate, too cruel for simple greed. As they crept back towards the ranch, a strange detail snagged at Eli's memory. Martha Gable's gossip, Pike's sermons. He kept talking about unnatural cures and God's judgment. His condemnation of Mara felt too personal, too venomous. And Eli remembered something else, seeing Pike more than once over the last year standing alone in the town cemetery. Not by the new graves, but in the old section by a pair of small weathered stones that had been there for years. Their final stop 2 nights later was the town well. From a hiding place in the rocks above, they watched. Just before dawn, when the sky was a pale, milky gray, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was one of Pike's deputies, a lanky man named Hatcher. He carried a small pouch, and with furtive glances over his shoulder, he knelt by the wellhead and carefully sprinkled a fine layer of white dust into the town's main water supply. Eli's hand tightened on his rifle stock. He had the man dead to rights. He could end it right here. But a single dead deputy wasn't proof. It was just another body. He needed Pike. He needed the whole rotten conspiracy laid bare. He waited until Hatcher was gone, and then he and Mara slipped down to the well. They had what they needed. The proof was undeniable. But as he looked toward the waking town, a cold knot of dread formed in his stomach. Exposing Pike's greed was one thing. But he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something deeper at play, a darkness in Caleb Pike that had nothing to do with money, and everything to do with a hate so profound it could poison the world to see it burn. The confrontation had to be on his terms, not in the public square where Pike controlled the narrative, but somewhere private where the truth could be spoken without the filter of fear. The sheriff's office, the heart of his power. Eli left Mara at the ranch, a decision she fought, but ultimately accepted. "He's dangerous, Eli," she warned, her hand on his arm. "His hatred for what I do. It's like a sickness in him." "I know," Eli said grimly. "That's what I have to understand." He rode into redemption in the flat gray light of midday. The town was quiet, the streets emptier than usual. The sickness had driven people indoors, leaving an air of quarantine hanging over the boardwalks. He tied his horse outside the sheriff's office and walked in without knocking. Pike was at his desk, meticulously cleaning his revolver. He looked up as Eli entered, his eyes showing no surprise, only a cold, predatory watchfulness. The office was neat, orderly, a reflection of the man himself. A map of the county hung on one wall, a gun rack on the other. On the corner of his desk sat the well-worn Bible. "Barrett Pike," said, his voice smooth as polished riverstone. "To what do I owe the pleasure? Come to turn in the witch." Eli closed the door behind him. "I came to talk about Arsenic Caleb." He tossed the tally book onto the desk. It landed with a soft thud next to the Bible. Pike didn't flinch. He simply glanced at the book, then back at Eli, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. "Found that in Silas Croft's feed store," Eli continued, his voice low and even. "Along with a crate of poison. We saw your deputy fouling the town well. It's over." Eli expected a denial. He expected a threat, a bribe, an attempt to bargain. He was prepared for a fight. He was not prepared for what came next. Caleb Pike leaned back in his chair and laughed. It was not a sound of mirth. It was a dry, broken sound, like stones grinding together in a landslide. It was the sound of a man whose grief had been hollowed out and filled with something terrible. Over Pike said the laugh, subsiding into a chilling smile. "Oh no, Eli. It's just beginning. You think this is about money, about land." He shook his head, a gesture of pity. You always were a simple man. You see a crime, you look for a simple motive. Greed, power. But you're wrong. He stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the desolate street. Do you remember my wife, Eli Eleanor, and my son Thomas? The question caught Eli off guard. He remembered them vaguely. A quiet woman and a small boy who had died years ago. A fever, people had said. A tragedy that had seemed to harden Pike to forge him into the unyielding man he was today. I remember, Eli said cautiously. They fell ill. Pike said, his voice dropping, becoming thick with a memory, as raw as an open wound. A fever that burned them up from the inside. We sent for the doctor, but he was miles away. So your wife came. Sarah. He spat the name like it was poison itself. She came with her poultices and her teas, her unnatural cures. She filled my house with the stink of strange weeds and chanted her little songs over my boy. Pike turned from the window, his eyes blazing with a righteous fire that was terrifying in its intensity. She promised me she could save them, and I, like a fool, believed her. I let her put her filthy concoctions into their bodies, and I watched them die. I watched my son draw his last ragged breath, while your wife muttered about the spirits of the earth. The air in the room grew thick, heavy with the weight of Pike's decade-old rage. She killed them, Eli, he hissed, taking a step closer. Her arrogance, her witchcraft. She murdered my family with her ignorance and pride. And you just let her do it. You let this whole town praise her as a saint. Eli was speechless. The accusation was so monstrous, so twisted he couldn't process it. Sarah had poured her soul into trying to save people. She had mourned every life she couldn't pull back from the brink. That's not what happened, Caleb. Eli managed, his voice strained. The fever was strong. Don't you dare defend her, Pike roared, slamming his fist on the desk. The Bible jumped. I've lived with that memory every single day. Every day I walk past the cemetery and see their graves, I feel that hate. A hate for her and for you, the man who stood by her. He began to pace the office, his movements agitated, a caged animal. For years I've prayed for a way to make you understand my pain, to make you feel what it's like to watch everything you love be destroyed by a so-called healer. And then she arrived. He stopped, a look of sublime, terrible revelation on his face. Mara Quinn, walking into my town, a perfect reflection of your Sarah. The same hands, the same herbs, the same damnable confidence. It was a gift from God, a chance for justice. The full, horrific truth crashed down on Eli. This wasn't about land. It wasn't about control. It was a meticulously crafted revenge, a theatrical production of grief and rage. Pike had poisoned his own town, terrorized his own people, all to frame an innocent woman, just to make Eli suffer the same loss he had. You're insane, Eli whispered. I'm righteous, Pike corrected, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial calm. I'm an instrument of vengeance. I wanted you to see her hang, Eli. I wanted you to feel that helplessness. And you, in your arrogant sentimentality, you rode in and saved her. You've inserted yourself directly into my judgment. You've made yourself the enemy. He walked back to his desk and calmly picked up his gun, checking the cylinder. I thought this would be a simple matter of justice. But you've turned it into a war. Before Eli could react, Pike strode to the door and flung it open. He fired his pistol twice into the air. The shots echoed through the silent town like a thunderclap. Help, Sheriff's Office. He bellowed, his voice instantly transforming from that of a conspirator to that of a victim. It's Barrett. He's gone crazy. He's protecting the witch. He's trying to kill me. Doors flew open. Men spilled out into the street, their faces confused, then alarmed. Pike pointed a trembling finger at Eli. "He's an outlaw, an accomplice to murder and witchcraft. There's a $500 bounty on his head, dead or alive." The world shifted under Eli's feet. He was no longer the accuser. He was the accused. Pike had twisted the truth with breathtaking speed, turning the town not just against Mara, but against him. He was trapped. The hunter had become the hunted. Eli didn't wait to see the confusion on the townspeople's faces turn to conviction. He dove through the side window of the sheriff's office in a shower of glass and splintered wood, landing hard in the dusty alleyway. Shouts erupted behind him. A gunshot splintered the window frame where his head had been moments before. He scrambled to his feet, ignoring the searing pain from the glass that had sliced his arm, and ran. He was a target now, his face and name attached to a bounty that would turn every desperate man with a gun into his enemy. His only thought was Mara. He had to get back to the ranch. He had to get her away before Pike's mob arrived. The manhunt began instantly. The clang of the town bell, once a call to prayer, now sounded a death knell. Pike's voice, amplified by the echoing streets, directed the posse. His words shaping the narrative: Eli Barrett, the grieving widower, driven mad by the witch's spell, now a dangerous outlaw. It was a simple, powerful lie, and in their fear the townspeople swallowed it whole. Eli reached his horse, cut the reins with his knife, and swung into the saddle. He galloped out of Redemption not as a resident, but as a fugitive, the shouts and gunshots fading behind him. He pushed the horse harder than he ever had. Before the wind tearing at his face, his mind a maelstrom of Pike's insane confession. This wasn't a fight for justice anymore. It was a fight for survival. He arrived back at the ranch to find Mara already packing a small bag with herbs, dried meat, and bandages. She had heard the gunshots echoing from town, and she knew what they meant. "We have to go," he said, his voice ragged as he slid from the horse. "Now, he's turned the whole town against us." There was no time for explanations. He grabbed his rifle, a box of cartridges, and the leather-bound journal, his mother's and Sarah's legacy of healing. It felt more important than ever to save it. They mounted his horse together, Mara clutching the journal to her chest, and fled into the harsh, unforgiving wilderness of the Badlands. For days they were hunted. Pike, knowing the land almost as well as Eli, pushed the posse relentlessly. They were a pack of hounds, their torches visible for miles at night, their shouts echoing through the canyons during the day. Eli and Mara were forced deeper into the cracked, arid labyrinth of rock and sand, a place where water was a prayer and shade was a fleeting gift. Their resources dwindled. The dried meat ran out. The water in their canteen grew warm and tasted of metal. Eli's arm, crudely bandaged by Mara, throbbed with a persistent, angry heat. Yet in the crucible of this shared hardship, a new bond formed between them. The lines of protector and protected blurred. Eli's knowledge of the land kept them hidden, while Mara's knowledge of the earth kept them alive. She found a hidden seep of water by identifying the plants that grew nearby. She made a paste of yarrow leaves to draw the infection from his wound. She found edible roots to quiet the gnawing hunger in their bellies. In the quiet of their hiding places, a shallow cave, a dense thicket of mesquite, they talked. He told her about Sarah, not just about her death, but about her life, her fierce compassion, the way she had believed in the healing power of the earth. "Pike hates me because he sees her in me," Mara said one night, her voice soft as she redressed his wound by the light of a tiny smokeless fire. "His grief has turned to poison." "It's not just grief," Eli countered, looking at the journal she had so carefully protected. "It's guilt. I just don't know what he's guilty of." The pieces didn't add up. Sarah had been the best healer in the territory. It was inconceivable that she could have made a fatal mistake. Pike's story was warped, twisted by years of festering rage. There was a missing piece of truth buried even deeper than his vendetta. One afternoon, hiding in a rock formation that overlooked the trail back towards redemption, they watched Pike and his posse ride by. The sheriff looked exhausted, but driven his face a mask of grim resolve. As he passed, a piece of paper fluttered from his saddlebag, caught by a gust of wind. It was a small, almost insignificant event, but it landed in a creosote bush just yards from their hiding spot. After the posse was gone, Eli retrieved it. It was a receipt, old and faded, from a land surveyor in a town 50 miles away. It was dated 10 years ago, just a month before Pike's family had died. The note at the bottom read, "Water potability test for the new well. Results highly contaminated. Unfit for human consumption. Advise sealing well immediately." Eli stared at the paper, the words blurring. The new well. Pike had dug a new well on his property just before his family got sick. Everyone had talked about it. He'd been so proud. The final terrible piece of the puzzle slammed into place. It wasn't Sarah, Eli whispered, his voice hoarse with the horror of the revelation. It was never her. It was his own well. His own water poisoned his family. Mara looked at the paper, her eyes wide. He knew all this time, he knew. Or he couldn't face it. Eli said, the full weight of Pike's tragic, self-inflicted damnation settling upon him. It was easier to blame her, to blame a healer, than to admit his own pride, his own negligence, killed his wife and child. Pike's entire crusade, his decade of righteous fury, was a lie he had told himself to escape an unbearable truth. His guilt was the poison, and it had finally leached out to contaminate everything around him. They now held the truth, the real proof. But they were out of food, low on water, and trapped in the Badlands. As if on cue, the sky to the west began to darken, not with rain, but with the ominous churning yellow-brown of a coming dust storm. The wind picked up, howling through the canyons, carrying the scent of grit and ozone. The storm was a terrifying force of nature. But to Eli it was something else. It was cover. It was a chance. He'll have to take shelter in town. Eli set his eyes on the approaching wall of dust. His posse will scatter. The town will be blind. He looked at Mara, his decision made. We're going back. The dust storm hit redemption like a biblical plague. The sky turned a sickening shade of ochre, and the sun vanished behind a roiling wall of dirt. Wind screamed through the streets, tearing shingles from roofs and rattling windows in their frames. The world was reduced to a maelstrom of stinging grit and howling noise. It was the perfect storm, a physical manifestation of the chaos and lies that had consumed the town. Under its cover, Eli and Mara slipped back into the deserted streets, hunched against the gale, their faces wrapped in torn pieces of cloth. Visibility was less than 5 feet. The town was a ghost of itself. Every door barred, every window shuttered against the onslaught. Eli knew where Pike would be the saloon. It was the largest, most fortified building in town and the natural place to weather a storm like this. They made their way to the alley behind the saloon, the wind trying to tear them from their feet. The back door was locked. Eli put his shoulder to it once, twice, and on the third try, the old wood splintered and gave way. They stumbled inside into the relative quiet of the building. The air was thick with the smell of stale beer sweat and fear. A few lanterns cast a flickering, hellish glow through the haze of dust that had already seeped inside. Sheriff Pike was there, just as Eli predicted. But he wasn't alone. He had a half-dozen townspeople with him, caught out when the storm hit the bartender, the blacksmith, Martha Gable from the general store, and a few others. They were huddled together, their faces pale with fear. and Pike had Mara's satchel of herbs, which he had presumably taken from her cabin, dumped on a table. Pike stood by the bar, a shotgun cradled in his arms, his back to the door. He was speaking to his captive audience, his voice a low, menacing sermon over the roar of the wind. A test of our faith, he was saying. The devil sends not only the witch, but the storm to cover her deeds. But we will not falter. We will see this through. We will cleanse this town. Eli moved silently from the doorway, his Colt in his hand. The only thing that needs cleansing here is your conscience, Caleb, he said, his voice cutting through Pike's speech. Every head snapped towards him. Pike spun around his face, a mask of disbelief that quickly hardened into pure fury. He raised the shotgun. Eli Mara screamed, but the blacksmith, a burly man named Gus, acted on instinct. He lunged not at Eli but at Pike, trying to grab the barrel of the shotgun. Pike shoved him back with brutal force, sending the big man crashing into a table. The saloon erupted into chaos. Pike swung the shotgun towards Eli. Eli fired not to kill, but to disarm. His shot was true, splintering the wooden stock of the shotgun and sending it flying from Pike's grasp. Pike roared in frustration and drew his pistol. The standoff was a maelstrom of swirling dust and flickering light. It was Eli and a terrified, cornered Pike, with a handful of innocent lives caught in the middle. "It's over," Eli said, his voice steady despite his pounding heart. He held up the surveyor's receipt. "I know about the well, Caleb. I know how your family really died." The color drained from Pike's face. For a single shattering moment, the mask of the righteous lawman fell away, revealing the broken, guilt-ridden man beneath. The gun in his hand wavered. "Lies," he whispered, the word lost in the howl of the wind. "Witches' tricks." "Was it a trick that made you keep this?" Eli pressed, taking a step forward. "Did you keep it to punish yourself, to remind yourself every day of the truth you couldn't face?" Pike's eyes darted around the room, seeing the dawning horror and confusion on the faces of the townspeople. His carefully constructed world was collapsing around him. His lie, the lie that had fueled him for a decade, was being torn apart. With a desperate cry of rage, he lunged not at Eli, but at the closest person to him, Mara. He grabbed her, pulling her in front of him, as a shield, pressing the barrel of his pistol to her temple. "Everybody back!" he screamed, his voice cracking. "I'll kill her, I swear to God, I'll kill another one of his witches." The room froze. Eli's aim was steady, but he couldn't risk a shot. The climax was no longer just about the truth. It was a battle of wills, a psychological war waged in the heart of the storm. "Let her go, Pike," Eli said, his voice dropping, becoming almost gentle. "It wasn't Sarah's fault. It wasn't your fault. It was a mistake. A terrible, tragic mistake. But this is a choice. Don't let your guilt make you a murderer." Guilt? Pike laughed, the sound hysterical. "I have nothing to be guilty of. She killed them. The healer killed them." He was shouting now, trying to convince himself as much as anyone else. Mara held fast, and his grip did not struggle. She looked at Pike, her eyes filled not with hate, but with a profound and startling pity. "Your son," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "Did he have a fever that wouldn't break, and pains in his stomach? Did his skin feel cold and clammy?" Pike stared at her, his grip slackening for a fraction of a second. How did you know that?" "Because those are the symptoms of arsenic poisoning," she said softly. "Not fever. The herbs your wife took, willow bark, sage, they would have done nothing. They couldn't have hurt him. But they couldn't have saved him either. No one could have." Her words, a simple diagnosis from a healer, were more devastating than any bullet. They were the truth spoken with compassion, and they shattered the last of Pike's defenses. The pistol trembled in his hand. The fight went out of his eyes, replaced by a vast, empty chasm of despair. He was no longer a righteous avenger or a cunning villain. He was just a man finally forced to confront the ghost of his own making. The saloon door burst open, and two men stood silhouetted against the storm, and their dusters whipping in the wind. Federal marshals. Eli must have had a friend in the town doctor after all. Pike looked at the marshals, at Eli, at the crumpled receipt on the floor. He looked at Mara, the healer who had condemned him with her kindness. With a shuddering sob, he let the gun clatter to the floor. He sank to his knees, a broken man in a storm of his own creation, the roar of the wind, the only sound left to fill the silence of his ruined soul. As the dust storm subsided, so too did the fever of hatred that had gripped redemption. The wind died down to a weary sigh, and a pale, watery sunlight filtered through the dust-choked air, illuminating a town stunned into silence. The truth once revealed was a harsh and sobering light. The townspeople emerged from the saloon, their faces etched with shame and disbelief. They looked at the wreckage, the splintered door, the shattered tables, the broken man being led away in cuffs by the federal marshals. And they looked at Mara. She wasn't celebrating her victory. She was already kneeling beside Gus the blacksmith, who had taken a nasty gash on his forehead, gently cleaning the wound with a cloth dipped in whiskey. Her hands were steady, her voice calm and reassuring. Her first instinct, even now, was to heal. In the days that followed, a quiet, profound change settled over redemption. There were no grand apologies, no public displays of repentance. The guilt was too deep for that. Instead, the town began to atone through small acts of kindness. A basket of fresh bread was left on the porch of Mara's cabin. The blacksmith offered to fix her broken door for free. Martha Gable, her eyes downcast, pressed a bag of the finest coffee beans into Mara's hands, muttering, "For the cold nights." Mara accepted it all with a quiet grace. She earned their trust back, not with words, but with the work of her hands. She tended to the lingering sickness, correctly identifying the last of the arsenic poisoning and brewing remedies to help cleanse it from their systems. She became not just a healer, but a symbol of the town's capacity for redemption, a quiet reminder of their brush with darkness and their slow, painful crawl back toward the light. Eli recovered the silver locket from Pike's personal effects, handed over by a grim-faced marshal. The hinge was bent, and the surface was scratched, but the tiny portrait inside was unharmed. Sarah's smile seemed to look out at him, a ghost from a life he was finally beginning to understand. He had spent 2 years buried in his grief, believing he had failed to protect her. But he now knew that Sarah's true legacy wasn't in a locket or on a headstone. It was in the resilience of the human spirit, in the quiet, persistent act of healing. It lived on in Mara. Months later, autumn had laid its gentle hand on the valley. The harsh sun of summer had softened, and the cottonwoods along the riverbank were turning a brilliant, defiant gold. The town of Redemption was healing its scars, still visible, but no longer raw. Mara's cabin had become a clinic, a place of hope, where the door was always open. Eli rode out to the town cemetery. The granite headstone he had wanted to buy was finally in place. Its clean, simple lines, a stark contrast to the weathered markers around it. Sarah Barrett, beloved wife and healer. He stood before it for a long time, the silence of the place broken only by the rustle of dry leaves. He took out the silver locket and ran his thumb over the etched primroses. "I was wrong, Sarah," he said, his voice quiet, the words meant only for her and the wind. "I thought I had to guard your memory like a tomb. But it's not a memory. It's a seed. It's still growing. He gently placed the locket on the stone base of the monument. Then from his saddlebag, he took a small fragrant bundle of dried herbs, sage yarrow, and willow tied with a simple piece of twine. A gift from Mara. He laid the herbs beside the locket, a symbol of a legacy passed on, of a circle completed. He had finally let go of his guilt, making peace with the past by embracing the future. He mounted his horse and turned not back toward the solitude of his ranch, but toward the distant, hopeful lights of the town. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the land. But for the first time in a very long time, Eli Barrett was not afraid of the dark. He rode toward a new life, no longer a recluse, but a man ready to stand in the light.